Hello, I'm Tony Morbin, Editor-in-Chief at SC Media UK. Today I'm joined by Stuart Davis, Director of Incident Response at CrowdStrike. We're going to be talking about the Cyber Intrusion Services Casebook and the implications from that research. Stuart, first of all, what was the rationale behind doing the Cyber Incident Casebook?
CrowdStrike provides a number of reports yearly to our community and customers. We provide an intelligence report, we provide an Overwatch report, and we also have our Casebook Services report. The Casebook Services report is a collection of events and activities that we've seen from the front lines of investigations that we've worked with our clients on site. What we wanted to do is we wanted our community to understand what are the trends that we're seeing that are evolving over the year. We want to tell them about the new toolings that we see actors using, the new tactics and procedures. And ultimately, we want our community to take this information and say, do we know how to map this in our own environment? Do we know how to detect this? And could we adequately respond? So our goal really is about to build the community's knowledge of this. We've been doing it for several years. When I look to what has been notable.
Yeah, I was going to ask, was there anything particularly surprising in the report?
When I look to what was surprising and notable, I'm probably going to focus on maybe two key trends. One was the growth and sophistication of actors leveraging ransomware. A second is customers or organizations that we work with that have been targeted by groups that are aligned to the interests of China. So we've seen a big uptick on that, a consistent uptick throughout the year. We've also reported through many blogs that we provided on the website and other conversations through our executive leadership to talk about these trends. So the specifics of those two cases have been quite alarming. We go through in detail in the casebook some of the case studies surrounding those attacks.
I mean, we're going to be covering state actors a bit later, but just on the ransomware, what sort of changes have there been that make it more sophisticated?
Yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately, actors have had to evolve their tactics to ensure that the ultimate ransom is paid. So when we looked back to several years ago, customers suffered compromises of their network by having ransomware deployed, and the actors would wait for a period of time for you to contact them, notify and organize and the actual key to decrypt your content. What actors have done now, and we take an example, one actor group that we track known as Grim Spider. When we look to this group, what they do is they leverage commonly known tools, which is important, I'll come back to that. They get this tooling within the environment, they set it up, they themselves have access and persistence in the environment, and then as part of the execution of their ransomware, they compromise, they encrypt, and they make inaccessible the customer's data. At this point, they make it easy for the client to contact them. When a client decides, we are not going to go down that route, we are now going to reconstitute our data from backups and systems, the attacker is still persisting in their network. They simply wait for that backup to be restored, and they redo their compromise activities to reinfect that system again, and ultimately the customer is forced into a situation, I can't even get back from this, I must pay. If I'm to put a litmus test or a tipping point, an event or a time, just look to the earlier part of December 2018, when the largest Bitcoin payment that CrowdStrike was aware of at the time was paid. That was 99.99 Bitcoins. That was $429,000 for a single organization that wished to retrieve their data. This group that's one case among many that we've been tracking in our intel, and we've provided that knowledge and awareness to our clients. So they are understanding what is the cost here of paying the victim, if I even get the key, versus the cost of remediating and doing this and trying to get it back from our backups ourselves. So these are important pieces of data clients need to know when they're making that decision during an investigation and a remediation.
These kind of costs that you're talking about are business threatening. I mean, it's a real business risk. Now, the boardroom, the C-suite, they understand business risk, but they don't really understand cybersecurity. So whose role is it to actually educate them about how cybersecurity is now a business risk?
Agreed. Yes, you get to understand this when you work with organizations. A CEO will have a certain understanding. The chief risk officer will have a certain understanding. But ultimately, the person who I would work with most that would be deemed and tasked to educate the board and the executive is going to be the CISO. The Chief Information Security Officer is tasked with a very complicated and difficult goal of translating technical requirements into business requirements. And every time I have learned myself from the most successful CISOs has been that exact statement by them, which is, in the course of my learnings and my career, I've learned to talk business. This could be easily demonstrated in any board meetings or situations where new CISOs come in and they talk about, we have the need to build firewalls and we need to detect these small intrusions, and a lot of technical, sophisticated conversation and content. But the business can't understand this. They can't link that to profits, margins, uptime, downtime, and customer satisfaction. So the CISO today has to try and bridge that world and communicate what the cyber defenses are, where we are as our maturity, the risks that are posed, and how does this impact our customers, our brand, our stock. And in between there is they usually use the help of the legal team to do some translation, finance, who understand ultimately the return on investment they're expecting from investing in cybersecurity. So I think things like cyber insurance now has also made that something easier and more difficult in the same way for Chief Information Security Officer, because they're now asking business, let's use this to defer risk.
So the CISO very much moving from a technical role to, I've even heard it used as a BISO, Business Information Security Officer. That articulation and wider remit beyond the technical, you see that as something that's just going to increase? Absolutely.
Digital transformation is a regrettable kind of buzzword that we use to describe everything that transforms and automates in the technology space. When I look to the actors that we focus against, I see them all working to aligned interests of countries that have economic visions going up as far as 2045.
Mm-hmm. So on those countries, I mean, I'm very interested that you do look a lot at state actors. You mentioned China, also Russia, Iran, North Korea. For the average business, do they actually feel that they are under threat from state actors, and why do we need to know about state actors?
I think the hardest thing for a company to be told today is you need to worry about everything, because what do they prioritize? What do they ultimately say? What is our worry? One good thing that we have is we have a huge team that supports us in our services. That's the Intel team in CrowdStrike. These are the guys who do a lot of the hard work of joining the dots of what actors do and the toolings they use. So one advantage customers get from our Intel is an understanding of what adversaries do and who they target. So if a client says, I'm in aviation, this is what I do, here's where I am, here are the airports I work with, here are the third-party GDS and other providers, who are the actors that would target me in my supply chain? CrowdStrike has that intel. We can use our knowledge and observables to describe to that client, here's your supply chain, here's the risks, here are the targeted countries, and here are the actors that do employ that. And for example, we have seen Iran focus against the aviation industry over the last kind of 18, 24 months, which may be something they hadn't done previous to that, across the supply chain, which is a very important part, rather than just saying, oh, Iran target aviation in terms of airlines. That's not the case. It's the entire supply chain.
How confident can you be in the attribution? I mean, there are cases all the time of people pointing fingers at different states. Just recently, Zurich Insurance declined a claim because they were saying that it was an act of war by Russia. We're talking about NotPetya. It may be commonly accepted, knowledge in the industry, but how sure can you be on attribution?
Attribution is it's a difficult game. What provides the confidence for our intel teams? Number one is the collective data that they have. So for a company like CrowdStrike, they took a bet from day one that we're going to be a cloud company that's going to store all of our data in the cloud, and we're going to use this knowledge to understand what actors do. Now in Intel, there are a couple of things you commonly need to know to be confident of what groups are and where they're aligned to. Things like what infrastructure they use, what targets they're targeting, how consistent the toolings they're using. So I'll be very frank, the way you attribute to a group can often take years of research. So it's not a case that we come across a file, it's new, and we think to ourselves, this is a new group. When a group is created, it's often because we've seen the correlation between different clients, different organizations, different parts of the world. And only at that point then, when we have that confidence, do we give a label. Mm-hmm. So it's really a long build-up that no one ever is really aware of. And this gives the Intel team themselves the confidence that they're talking about the right groups. In addition to that, what CrowdStrike does is we give naming conventions that break out and make it simpler for our clients to understand. These are the countries and these are the different groups, right? So we might have Stone Panda, Wicked Panda, which are two different groups that are aligned to interests of the Chinese government.
Mm-hmm. Almost going to the other extreme, another area of the findings was the growth in the use of social engineering and particularly phishing, which has long been a problem. Does that mean that people are still our biggest issue? Is it all about educating the workforce at the other end of from the state actors, our actual inside staff?
So awareness is very important to users about not clicking on links and being confident about the reputation of somebody that you're receiving an email for. I'm going to tell you that customers are getting better. They are getting better at educating their workforce. The percentages are getting smaller that users are clicking, but they still are. Now, I have to balance that with one of the trends from our casebook, which talks a little bit about groups not just focusing on phishing now. They're actually expanding out their tactics to include getting into a customer's environment through exposed and vulnerable web services that they have, one of their e-commerce platforms, etc. Historically, phishing had the quickest return. It was easy to employ, and you could get instant responses from organizations. But because users are becoming more aware now, groups are modifying their tactics to say, what does this customer have exposed on the internet? Can we gain access that way? So this changes the dynamics somewhat, and groups and actors will always do this as they start to see the economics of attacking organizations change. So to me, if they're doing more on the web application side today, then I'm going to say the users are getting better as a deductive analysis.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the report doesn't just talk about the threats, it also talks about potential remedies. One of the remedies we're talking about is integrating next generation endpoint with more proactive sort of behavior analysis and looking inside. Isn't that a contradiction? I mean, are we bumping up our endpoint to stop people getting in, or is it more important to be catching people once they're in and just accepting that they're already there?
It's a complicated area in terms of how customers deal with maturity, but the reality is we need to do both. The reality is that customers need to improve the way that they prevent a breach occurring, but also they need to be able to build up mechanisms and capabilities to respond to a breach if it occurs. So there is no silver bullet that brings us to a situation where a company can lean on one or the other. Mm-hmm. Our goal as a company is we want to prevent the impact of a breach. So if an adversary has 10 minutes on a system because they gained access, in that 10 minutes there's very limited things they can do. The impact of the breach is minimal. If an adversary has 85 days, which is the average dwell time that we had published in our casebooks, we start to see that actors actually have 85 days before they're detected. So the dwell time is just a way of us describing the time an actor gets in to the time a customer detects it. So what we really want to do with our clients is reduce that down to an absolute minimal.
As well as reducing the time, which is obviously going to mean that they have less chance to do harm, what other strategies do you suggest people adopt in terms of remediating if there has been a breach?
You know, one of the things I do really enjoy about working with CrowdStrike is we are willing to roll up our sleeves and help customers fix the issues that they have. A very important part of incident response is the ability to remediate an incident and put controls to defend against those type of incidents in the future. So the investigation is one part, but the remediation is another part. In this organization, we have talent and people and tools that are willing to actually fix the problems our customers face. Any large global company that we work with, and there's a number of them considerably, do not have the resources to deploy a workforce everywhere for every small incident, large or other. So having someone like CrowdStrike that's willing to use their tooling, automation, and the ability to remediate is very unique in the industry. And it's one of the things that I very much enjoy, particularly when I'm trying to reduce the cost of a remediation for a client.
In terms of tools, behavior analytics, automation, how does that play a part, and how does that compare to, if you like, outsourcing using third parties? Yeah.
So automation is really about freeing up time for analysts to do the things they need to do. We probably sold a concept of automation a different way in the past, about just ultimately making things a shorter time. But we really need to look at making things a shorter time for who. And one important part is that when we have a cyber incident of any magnitude, small, medium, or large, we need analysts to look at the problem. They shouldn't be spending their time doing repetitive tasks. They shouldn't be spending a lot of their time doing things that we could just automate easily. So one of the advances in the industry is around automating those activities that we know from our experience can be done. So what we end up with is a way that we can work with the client. We're getting answers faster because the analyst is getting to what they need quicker. And all the standard tasks that we've all done in the past, they're all integrated in a workflow that just gets automated. So the analyst sits at the console, has the answers they need, and they're communicating that to the client quickly. The casebook talks a little bit about that, but it's a dynamic we're always trying to get better at. Mm-hmm. And this is really why we have the combination of our intel and our incident response and our preventative capabilities and our tooling. If you can integrate all those together, the intel tells you what's happening. The tooling has the ability to thwart and get in the way of the attacker, and the consultant has the ability to steer the investigation, give you the best advice and understand what regulatory requirements we have, what do we need to do, and how to communicate that to the business. So really it's a big package that you are kind of consuming, and that's what we need today, and we're going to even need more enhanced versions of that in the future as actors get better at their own versions of automation.
Mm-hmm. Wicked Panda is one of the groups you've been looking at. What particular approaches were they doing that was different?
Yeah, what's very interesting about this particular group in the context of A, the casebooks and the uptick in the Chinese activity, but also B, what we're seeing today. CrowdStrike are running several engagements with this particular group as we see it. What's important about them is they're focusing on several industries at any one given time. These industries are across many different verticals, and ultimately they are very targeted industries, and those companies tend to be at the forefront of the industry in some way, that they have competitive edges. Mm-hmm. And then this organization, this group, Wicked Panda, aims to focus there and aims to have goals of targeting sensitive data and exfiltrating that out of the environment. What's kind of interesting about that group, as we're seeing them today, is they employ very sophisticated tooling. They've been doing these activities for a long time. And they're quite used to organizations identifying them, meaning that we've used, for instance, we have CrowdStrike who are helping us, and they've identified this activity. They're leaning on us for recommendations of how we then should pilot our way through incident response with that group. But this group are ultimately, due to their experience with seeing other products that know about them, know about their tooling, what they tend to do is they tend to alter and change their tactics. They do not retreat. They've also been seen to lay dormant for short periods of time. Knowing that we're a services division of a company, knowing that a company may opt to put the services on hold because they're not seeing any activity, the group actually know that this could aid them in people wrapping up an investigation and walking away.
So they're basically running down the clock on their victims so that they use up their budget for defence.
That becomes a method for them to one of their many methods. Another method is primarily they have a lot of knowledge in the Windows type environments where they built their toolings, but they've also built their toolings exact clones. They ported over to the Linux environments, etc. So if they feel as though they are being mapped out in those environments, they may switch over to the Linux in an effort to simply say, we're going to live over here for a while, and what we're going to do is continue our goals, but we're going to hope that you don't have expertise in this area. And some companies mightn't. Some companies might have predominant experience in Windows, and therefore their forensics in Linux and Mac can be limited. So this is really where we need two things. We need tooling that can give us an automated view across this. And for us, this is where customers, again, ultimately pay less for investigation because our Falcon tooling is supporting our investigators across Linux, Windows, Mac. So they are getting the automation, but also our Intel team are helping us understand, is this the consistent tooling we're seeing to Wikipanda? Is this the consistent lateral movement toolings, droppers, etc.? Just terminology to different toolings they're using. And this goes back to your question earlier about how confident can you be? And it's a question I've been asked by customers at the very beginning when they feel unsure as to, is this really a problem? Is this maybe just overhyped in terms of this is a highly critical alert, we appreciate that, but maybe this is a false positive. Actually, companies have suffered from false positives in the past, and that makes them worried. So we need to be very confident about, yes, this is a repeated tooling. We've seen this in multiple industries, multiple verticals, and we've even seen it within the last week. So this is a type of group that are in several organizations. CrowdStrike are responding to that. These are new companies to us. They're companies that are just come to us in terms of knowing what we did, and now we're starting to engage with them and work. So this is an important kind of, when we talk to the casebook, the case studies that we have, it's important for our community to kind of be aware of those, because they themselves then ask questions inward, which is, okay, do we know how to respond to this? Do we have the tooling that could detect this? And if the answer is yes, that's great. And then really it's about, what does our plan look like? So what does our incident response plan look like? Okay, do we have the buy-in from management? When we ask for things, we get it during a crisis situation. Does legal know that we're going to call them in when there's some regulatory requirement, or do we have a PR element when it comes to actually having to communicate with the public and what that statement will be, etc. And the better tooling we have means the first thing PR are going to want to know is what statement can we make about what we know? And the first question is going to be, have we checked every system and every file? And without automation and tooling that can do that, you end up kind of saying, we've checked half our network and we're in process. So this is the challenge between the crisis communications and ultimately the investigative. So this is where we help by minimizing that time. We're getting those answers back to the right people, and we're saying, of everywhere we've checked, we're confident that this is what has been exposed. And that is important for the communications team.
You've got information from more than 200 attacks. You've got a really global vision. What is the most important thing that companies that you see them not doing or not doing correctly, or maybe just not doing enough of, that they should actually change? You know, what's the most important lesson for companies to learn from this report?
That's a good question. If I look to the 200 or so cases that we had worked on, there are a number of areas that we see customers having common weaknesses in, including password management and other areas. But what we overall tend to see is customers lacking in some form of a cybersecurity program that defines how they would have an incident response plan, ultimately what charter that team would have to respond to these investigations. So what permissions they would have, how they would interact, how that's signed off by the business. We see customers not having communications planning done in preparation. So when we look to a number of these areas that have often expanded out the cost of a breach or the impact, we look to working with clients to say, if you took a step back, how could you prepare for that? How could you build a cyber security program that could take into these very specific areas of how we interact as an incident response team, what is our incident response plan, how do we communicate with the business? And we work with clients to define that across their business. We work with them to say, here's how we can ultimately allow this incident response team to do what they need to do, to use the toolings that they need to gain the visibility. We often find that when we come into an environment, customers can probably see about 10 to 20% of what the attacker's doing. So they have logging set up, some form of it. They have their antivirus, their firewall, and through a combination of all this, they have some forms of the visibility. And we're just asking them, how do we bring what you have up to the level you need to cover all the areas the attacker does? The reconnaissance, the initial access, lateral movement, and exfiltration, all these different areas that we need to be able to see to make conclusive assessments on not just what happened, but how do we fix it. So really, when I look to the areas of weakness, we kind of have asked customers before they ever had a problem, would you want to build up these areas, improve them, and then ultimately have a framework that allows you to reduce the impact of these breaches. So some of the kind of common areas that we've seen through the cases have allowed us to feed that back into clients in a proactive way. And that's probably one of the kind of the bigger values they get out of our knowledge of the frontline breaches that we've investigated.
And does that extend into liaising with legal and PR and those sorts of areas?
Yeah, very much. As a part of that framework, you've got the communications. There's going to be an element of crisis communications, how that interacts with the PR, how it interacts with your legal team. And we often do those simulations with those teams so that none of this is new to them. Those are kind of dry run exercises that some organizations have done in the past. These are great ways for companies to have said, we're pretty confident this is in place. But then when we go to do the exercise, we see the cracks, we see the gaps, and then we write that out as a way of saying, over the next couple of months, assuming we can, let's fix these cracks and gaps. Some companies look to this as a really mandatory thing. They want to do these drills just like they would do a fire drill. They want to do these drills consistently so that if the actual event did occur and it's of a magnitude that impacts the business, these teams are going to coordinate together, not going to be new, and they're going to have ultimately they're going to investigate and remediate quickly, which can significantly reduce the cost that organizations face or are exposed to as part of these breaches. So it's a very important part of it.
So Stuart, presumably that kind of all-encompassing approach needs to be led by the CEO.
Yes. What we're always trying to do is we're trying to prevent situations where the CEO has to learn about cyber through a trauma, where they have to be told by the CISO and the CFO that we need out-of-band emergency funding to deal with an incident. So what we're trying to really communicate to the CEO is how could these impacts affect, your vision and plan for this company, and that's going to have a lot of attributes, including the reputation of the company, how their customers view their service or whatever it might be, and ultimately how does that play into the strategy the CEO and other parts of the board are looking to invest, right? Whether they want to digitize or not, or expand their customer support or not. So we're always looking for a way to provide the CEO with almost forward-looking knowledge that's competitive data for the CEO. I.e., if you guys are learning about how to better protect, if you're doing cybersecurity programs with CrowdStrike, if that's being advocated by you, you can use this as a competitive differentiator to say, okay, we haven't had an impact, but as a CEO, we've invested with top security providers in cyber who know our business, who know who target us, and they know what we're putting in place to better protect our customer data so that this doesn't become an exposure, right? And we see this in all different ways, that we ourselves are even trying to show and promote that we're willing to take risks for our customers. And we see like the cyber insurance that we've put out for our clients to show the how confident we are in our own technologies. So this is what I see as CEOs can either learn from the trauma and the experience, or proactively they can take the knowledge that we have and then use it as some form of a competitive advantage against their customers.
Stuart, there's a lot more in the report that we could cover, but I'm afraid that's going to have to be it for now. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you for joining us today.